we're back for part two in a new app, so I appreciate your patience. We were talking about Gene Toomer, and I did look up his birthplace. He was born in Washington, grew up, spent much of his life in the North. And I should point out, because if you Google him, you will learn this, and you will be like, wait, what? She's talking about him as if this text is Black modernism. And I think when you read the text, that is unmistakable. But Toomer's ideas of race do not fit neatly into what I'll call bookstore categories. Partly this changed through his life. He became really interested in mysticism. He was really interested in other understandings of race, the idea that racial formations are in the process of changing such that through a more cosmopolitan society, we would all become engaged in familial networks that were multiracial, and race would cease to mean what it emphatically meant in 1923 when Cain was published, right? That was the phrase was a Jim Crow world, right? There were multiple races, race always being a complicated construction, but the color line was enforced through various mechanisms, some corporate, some contractual, some just part of practice, and some viciously enforced, right? And some politically enforced. So, but Toomer thought that the world would and could change, and in a way that in our contemporary world, where we've recently experienced a period of post-racial enthusiasm, right? Race is no longer a source of discrimination in America. There was a moment when people argued that after President Obama's election. Then that argument did not hold up, right? We know that. And so looking back to 1930, I guess would be the moment when Toomer's own racial identity was overtly fluid. Looking back at that moment, one could think, wow, is he selling out? What is he doing? And I think the answer is this was another form of experimentation. He was an experimental writer, and there was experimentation in his life as well. I don't know enough about his politics to say more about it than that, but I don't think he gained a lot of advantage necessarily by ceasing to depict himself as a Black man. You might think, well, of course he did, but it's not massive advantage, right? He really did have a philosophical perspective, even if that philosophy was not grounded, it was explicitly not grounded in deep sociological analysis of the United States, right? He was influenced by visionaries, wanted to be a visionary, and that's how he was coming at this. I bring this up in part because I'm contrasting him with Richard Wright, who had a deep sociological analysis of race in the United States. He hung out with sociologists. Wright's approach to art and politics was in some ways very different from Gene Toomer's, and his background was very different. Toomer, as I suggested last time, was a descendant of the Black elite, and Richard Wright was a sharecropper's child in Mississippi, largely self-educated. So he he had seen a different side of life, experienced a different side of life from what Jean Toomer had, and was very strongly influenced by Marxism. I put him together with Locke and Toomer precisely because of these differences. What's fascinating is how much these texts share, despite their authors' extraordinary diversity and, at some level, philosophical antagonism even. Um, you'll note that Wright is really struggling to think about how religiosity and spirituality could be a powerful, enlightening force in Black literature. As a communist, he was not he was not a religious man. That's not where he was coming from. But he saw that the Black church was a source of community and strength and education in a lot of ways. Just a tremendous resource for Black communities and maybe especially Black Southern communities. And he wanted to think about how Black people more broadly, Black artists, could engage with that legacy, with that continuing practice, and think about how the arts and religious communities could collaborate for political transformation. Religiosity, obviously central to Toomer as well. It's something that he's clearly struggling with. I don't think Wright read Kane and then said, I'm going to sit down and write this essay. There's too big of a gap between the two, and Wright was reading too many things for that to be the source of these concerns. But when you put these two texts together, what you see is that this really was a central question in Black modernism. Also, obviously, the Blueprint for Negro Writing is an iconic text, like it's a perfectly exemplary text for modernism as movement, right? For the way in which writers were engaging with political theories and ideas about what the arts could do in society. That was central to Locke's New Negro anthology as well. So there are a lot of differences in these texts and a lot of continuities, and all of them have this sort of complex map of Black America within the larger world, a larger Black and also other world. This brings us down to Faulkner, and I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh, I've got to do Faulkner. But then I was reading my friend Hossam's book. I returned to that about a week ago for a completely different reason and thought, wow, I have to share this with them because his map of modernism, of the arts, and of their theoretical underpinnings and ramifications is just so relevant to the way people think about modernism now. Well, certainly the way I think about it, but I think it's this idea of a broader modernist world, of global South influences on and participation in modernism is so important. A Rose for Emily is not Faulkner's most innovative work by any means. It's something probably many of you have read before. Coming here, you probably expect to read at least a little Faulkner in grad school, so there's a tiny, tiny bit for you. It is, I think, interesting to think about how Faulkner maps this town in his descriptions of Emily's world and the gaze placed on Emily. There's going to be a lot in our reading for this week on women's bodies being gazed at in ways that at some points are just downright aggressive. I'm not trying to traumatize you. I'm sorry if it comes off that way. I think this is modernism, though, right? It's not as if women writers did not report recognition of such gazes. So that is definitely something we can talk about. Whose bodies are being gazed at, whose voices are being heard. Um, Emily and her butler aren't the voices, and uh, that is something we can talk about in the classroom. But I love Hossam's reading of that story, and I love the way it provides a, a sort of global South framework for thinking about U.S. Southern literature. There are ways, Wright and Faulkner, people often talk about, outside of Mississippi, people may not talk about them together very often, but here we do, because they're both from here. And there was so much difference in their work, for reasons that have so much to do with social position and experience. But the central concerns in their work, there's some similarity there as well. And you won't see the interest in religion in A Rose for Emily. You won't see much interest in Black Southerners, but there's just enough for it to register as an absence. We could talk about that in the classroom as well, what it means to sort of foreground that one is not talking about Black people on the whole. I'm thinking one of your colleagues, Will Underland, has a wonderful phrase for that. Emphatic backgrounding. That's his phrase. You can ask him about it. I'm not trying to steal it from him. It's a great phrase to think about in terms of A Rose for Emily, though. I hope that gives you some things to think about for our class. We will, as I imagine, come in and pretty much start talking. Here's what I'd like you to do, each of you. Pick a moment from one of these texts. It could be critical, it could be literary, it could be a fusion of the two. Pick some moment that helps you understand something about modernism or about literary movements in a new way, something that picks up on a context you've encountered before this semester, or something that sparks a question that feels like it could be generative. How well, I'm not going to try and model that kind of question. Pick a moment that you want to talk about and that you feel as if maybe your colleagues, your fellow students and me could participate in a conversation that would be enlightening. Come in with some ideas about what it might mean or how you would like to interrogate the moment. Come in with a moment, and as I'm getting to know you, as you tell me who you are, eventually we'll get to the point where you can say, here's my moment, let's share, let's get into this, let's dig and understand modernist movements in specific sites in the US with their specific racial dynamics. I really look forward to talking with you all. Bye.